The flight that changed everything. It was supposed to be an ordinary flight, a mundane part of life that most people don't think twice about. The kind where the hours blend into the rhythm of engine hums and idle conversations. For Marcus Taylor, a sharp-dressed man in his early 40s, it was supposed to be an escape, a rare moment to step away from the city that demanded so much of him. As he boarded the plane, a sense of relief washed over him. The first-class ticket wasn't just a luxury. It was a gift to himself after months of relentless work. For Marcus, who had built his business from scratch in the competitive world of finance, this was a milestone. He had earned his place in the leather seat by the window, looking out over the tarmac with a quiet satisfaction. The boarding process was uneventful, save for the occasional glance thrown his way. Marcus was used to the double takes. Standing at 6'3", with an imposing presence, his tailored charcoal suit only added to his air of confidence. But today, something felt different, subtle, but distinct. He could feel it in the way some passengers hesitated just a beat too long as they passed by his seat. He dismissed it as paranoia and settled in, pulling out a hardcover book he had been trying to finish for weeks. The hum of passengers filing in, the flight attendants stowing luggage, and the faint announcements over the intercom provided a comforting white noise. "Good afternoon, sir." The voice interrupted his thoughts. Marcus looked up to see a flight attendant standing in the aisle, clipboard in hand. Her smile was polite, the kind perfected by years of corporate training. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of hesitation. "Afternoon," Marcus replied with an easy nod, returning to his book. She lingered for a moment longer than necessary, her gaze scanning him in a way that made him feel subtly scrutinized. Then she moved on, attending to the other passengers in the cabin. The plane began to taxi, the familiar jolt of the wheels against the runway signaling the start of the journey. Marcus leaned back, watching the city shrink beneath the clouds. He couldn't wait to leave behind the chaos of his work and the endless demands of clients. For the first time in a long while, he was determined to let himself relax. But the calm was short-lived. The flight attendant returned, a tray of drinks in her hand. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" she asked, her tone pleasant, but with a faint edge Marcus couldn't quite place. "Just water, please," he said, offering a small smile. She tilted her head, as though puzzled by his choice. "Are you sure? Most of our first-class passengers prefer champagne. It's complimentary, you know." Marcus raised an eyebrow. The comment wasn't overtly rude, but there was an undercurrent of judgment in her voice. He felt a slight unease but chose to brush it off. "Water's fine," he said firmly. She nodded, still smiling, and poured him a glass. "Of course. Enjoy your flight." Yet, as she walked away, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the interaction was more loaded than it seemed. He tried to focus on his book, but his thoughts kept circling back to her words. The plane reached cruising altitude, and Marcus closed his eyes, hoping to nap. But barely 10 minutes later, the same flight attendant was back, this time with a tray of snacks. "Would you like some pretzels or nuts, sir?" she asked. He glanced up, surprised by her persistence. "No, thank you. I'm good." She didn't move. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her smile now carrying a hint of something unsettling. "You don't look like the usual type we get up here." Marcus froze, the words sinking in like a cold blade. He had heard comments like this before, but never in a place where he was supposed to feel respected and equal. He looked at her, his face carefully neutral. "Excuse me." "Oh, it's nothing," she said with a casual laugh, waving a hand dismissively. "I just mean you're different. Most of our passengers up here are more, you know, the corporate type." Her words trailed off, but the implication was clear. Marcus felt his chest tighten, a mix of anger and disbelief rising within him. He had spent his life defying stereotypes, working harder than anyone else to prove his worth. And yet here he was, being reminded that no matter how much he achieved, there would always be someone ready to question his place. "Is there a problem with me sitting here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. She blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Oh no, not at all," she said quickly, her tone overly sweet. "I just meant it's nice to see someone unique." Marcus clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain composed. "I'm fine where I am. Thank you." The flight attendant's smile faltered, and for a brief moment something cold flashed in her eyes. But she recovered quickly, nodding before walking away. Marcus stared out the window, trying to process what had just happened. The city below had long disappeared, replaced by endless clouds, but the view no longer felt serene. The sanctuary of first class had been tainted, and Marcus couldn't ignore the tension that now sat heavy in the air, breaking the illusion. The tension lingered like a storm cloud overhead, its presence undeniable, even as the plane sailed smoothly through the sky. Marcus tried to focus on his book, but the words seemed to blur together. The flight attendant's words echoed in his mind, each repetition sharpening their sting. "Unique," she had said, as though his presence here was an anomaly, an exception to an unspoken rule. He had faced subtle prejudice before, smirks, glances, awkward silences. But this was different. This was direct, invasive, and layered with a veneer of politeness that made it all the more infuriating. As the cabin settled into a quiet hum, Marcus turned his gaze back to the clouds outside, searching for solace. He thought of his parents, who had instilled in him the value of hard work and resilience. His father's voice came back to him, a mantra he had heard countless times. "Always carry yourself with pride, son. You belong wherever you choose to be." But pride was a heavy armor, and today it felt harder than usual to wear. The flight continued, minutes stretching into an uneasy silence. The occasional sound of someone adjusting their seat or the clinking of glassware punctuated the stillness. Marcus noticed other passengers settling in with their meals or sipping champagne, seemingly oblivious to the tension that had wrapped itself around him. Just as he began to think the ordeal was behind him, the flight attendant returned. This time, her approach was slower, her smile sharper. She carried herself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and Marcus braced himself for whatever she was about to say. "Sir," she began, her tone syrupy, "I wanted to double-check. Are you sure you're comfortable? We aim to make all our passengers feel at home up here in first class." Marcus stared at her, his jaw tightening. Her words were innocuous on the surface, but the way she said them carried an undercurrent of something more. He could feel it in her tone, see it in her overly poised stance, and it grated against his patience. "I'm perfectly fine," he replied, his voice measured but firm. "Thank you for your concern." She lingered, tilting her head as if studying him. "It's just, well, some passengers prefer the seats closer to the aisle. They're a bit more, let's say, accommodating." Marcus's grip on his book tightened. The insinuation wasn't lost on him. She was playing a game, one designed to make him question himself, his place, and his worth. But he wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of a visible reaction. "I like my window seat," he said evenly, refusing to meet her bait. "I chose it for a reason." Her smile faltered for the briefest moment before she straightened. "Of course, sir. Just let me know if there's anything you need." With that, she walked away, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Marcus exhaled slowly, his fingers unclenching from around the book. He could feel his pulse in his ears, the rush of anger coursing through him. This wasn't just about her comments. It was about the principle. Her behavior was a reminder of the biases that people like him had to navigate, even in spaces they had rightfully earned. The cabin grew quieter as the meal service began. Marcus declined the offer of dinner, his appetite long gone. Instead, he watched as the other passengers were served with warmth and efficiency. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, their smiles genuine, their tone respectful. But none of them stopped at Marcus's seat, not even to offer a refill of water. The subtle isolation was intentional. Marcus knew this game, and he refused to let it get under his skin. But despite his resolve, A knot of frustration began to form in his chest. As the hours passed, the sky outside darkened, the plane gliding through the night. Marcus leaned his head against the window, trying to focus on the endless expanse of stars. He thought of the life he had built, how hard he had worked to climb the ladder, how many sacrifices he had made to sit in this very seat. But even as he reminded himself of his achievements, the sting of the flight attendant's words lingered. They weren't just an insult. They were a challenge to his identity, his right to exist unapologetically in a world that often tried to make him smaller. The quiet was interrupted by the faint sound of a voice. Marcus turned to see a man in his mid-50s, seated across the aisle. He was leaning toward the flight attendant, who stood beside him, their conversation low but audible enough for Marcus to catch snippets. "He shouldn't even be up here," the man muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. The flight attendant's response was a hushed laugh, her expression carefully neutral. "I understand, sir. Let me know if there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable." Marcus felt his stomach twist. The man wasn't even trying to hide his disdain, and the flight attendant's complicit smile only deepened the wound. He turned back to the window, swallowing the anger that threatened to rise. But as much as he wanted to stay silent, a part of him burned for action. For too long, he had brushed off these moments, telling himself they weren't worth the fight. But this time felt different. This time, the insult wasn't just personal, it was systemic, and ignoring it would only give it power. Taking a deep breath, Marcus straightened in his seat. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let this moment pass without making his voice heard. The tipping point. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as Marcus sat in his seat, staring blankly at the window. Outside, the stars glittered against the black canvas of the night sky, but their beauty offered little solace. His pulse was steady now, but his mind churned with thoughts. Memories of every slight, every moment he had been made to feel out of place. This was more than a flight. It was a microcosm of a larger struggle, a quiet battle fought daily by countless people like him. The snide remark from the man across the aisle played on a loop in his head. The flight attendant's laughter, her complicity, only deepened the wound. Marcus had faced this kind of prejudice before, but there was something particularly galling about experiencing it here, in a place he had earned through his own sweat and perseverance. The cabin lights dimmed, signaling the transition to nighttime mode. Passengers reclined their seats, pulling blankets over themselves or closing their eyes behind eye masks. But Marcus couldn't rest. His mind was a tempest, and no amount of deep breathing could calm the storm. Just then, a soft voice startled him. "Excuse me, sir." Marcus turned to see another flight attendant, a younger woman with kind eyes and a tentative smile. She held a tray with a glass of water and a neatly folded napkin. "I notice you haven't been served in a while," she said, placing the items on his tray table. Her voice was genuine, her demeanor contrasting sharply with her colleagues. "Let me know if you need anything else." "Thank you," Marcus replied, his voice tinged with surprise. For the first time since boarding, he felt a flicker of warmth. But as she walked away, his gaze drifted back to the other flight attendant, the one who had sparked this chain of events. She stood at the front of the cabin, chatting with the same man who had made the disparaging comment earlier. Her body language was relaxed, her laughter carrying faintly over the sound of the engines. Marcus clenched his fists. Enough is enough, he thought. He had spent the entire flight trying to rise above, to maintain his composure. But he couldn't let this slide. Not this time. A step toward confrontation. He pressed the call button. The soft chime drew the attention of the flight attendant, the one who had avoided his seat since her last exchange with him. She hesitated for a moment before walking over, her practiced smile firmly in place. "Yes, sir. How can I assist you?" she asked, her tone sickly sweet. Marcus met her gaze, his voice steady. "I need to speak to the captain." Her smile wavered, but she quickly recovered. "The captain is currently occupied, sir. Is there something I can help you with?" "This isn't something you can handle," Marcus replied, his tone firm. "I need to speak to someone in charge." She blinked, clearly unprepared for his directness. "Perhaps I can relay your concern." "No," Marcus interrupted. His voice wasn't raised, but the authority in it made her step back slightly. "I'll wait." The cabin seemed to grow quieter, the weight of the moment palpable. Passengers shifted in their seats, sensing the tension. The flight attendant's lips pressed into a thin line before she nodded curtly and walked toward the cockpit. Minutes passed, each one stretching endlessly as Marcus sat upright, his hands resting on his thighs. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him, their curiosity tangible. He ignored them, focusing instead on steadying his breath. He wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. The captain's arrival. The captain emerged from the cockpit, his expression calm but inquisitive. He was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a neatly pressed uniform that exuded authority. The flight attendant trailed behind him, her face carefully blank. "Good evening, sir," the captain began, his voice polite but cautious. "I understand you requested to speak with me." "Yes, thank you for coming," Marcus said, standing to meet him at eye level. He extended a hand, which the captain shook firmly. "My name is Marcus Taylor, and I'd like to report an incident." The captain's brow furrowed slightly, and he gestured toward the galley, away from the prying ears of other passengers. Marcus followed, the flight attendant trailing a few steps behind. "What seems to be the problem?" the captain asked once they were out of earshot. Marcus took a deep breath before speaking. "I've been subjected to unprofessional and discriminatory behavior by one of your crew members." He glanced briefly at the flight attendant, whose face remained impassive, before turning back to the captain. "Her comments and actions have made it clear that she does not believe I belong in this cabin, and her treatment of me has reflected that." The captain's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "I see. Can you provide me with specific examples?" Marcus recounted the events in detail. The condescending remarks, the refusal of service, the laughter shared with the passenger who had openly questioned his presence in first class. As he spoke, the flight attendant's composure began to crack. Her cheeks flushed, and her hands fidgeted at her sides. When Marcus finished, the captain turned to her. "Is this true?" he asked, his tone sharp. She opened her mouth to respond but faltered. I may have been misunderstood," she stammered. "I never intended." "Intent doesn't matter as much as impact," the captain interrupted, his voice firm. "If your behavior caused a passenger to feel unwelcome, that's a serious issue." Marcus felt a small surge of vindication, but he wasn't done. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about the culture you're fostering on this flight. If this is how first-class passengers are treated, I can only imagine what happens in the rest of the cabin." The captain nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Taylor. I apologize for what you've experienced. Rest assured, this matter will be addressed immediately." The turning point. The captain turned to the flight attendant. "You're relieved of your duties for the remainder of this flight. Return to the galley and remain there unless instructed otherwise." Her eyes widened, but she didn't argue. With a curt nod, she turned and walked away, her shoulders tense. Marcus exhaled, a sense of relief washing over him. The captain offered another apology before returning to the cockpit, leaving Marcus alone in the galley. For the first time that evening, he felt a flicker of hope, not just for himself, but for the possibility of change. When he returned to his seat, the younger flight attendant who had brought him water earlier approached. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice quiet but sincere. Marcus nodded. "It's better now." "Thank you." She smiled, and for the first time since the flight began, Marcus felt a genuine connection, a reminder that not everyone saw him as an outsider. As the plane continued its journey, Marcus leaned back in his seat, his resolve stronger than ever. This wasn't just a flight anymore. It was the start of something bigger. Unmasking the layers. The tension in the cabin had dissipated slightly after the flight attendant was relieved of her duties, but for Marcus, the flight still felt far from over. The relief he felt was tempered by the weight of what had transpired. This wasn't simply about one person's behavior. It was a glimpse into a deeper, systemic problem that refused to remain hidden. As he settled back into his seat, a few passengers glanced his way, their expressions ranging from curious to mildly uncomfortable. Some avoided eye contact altogether, burying themselves in their books or headphones, as if ignoring the incident would make it vanish. Marcus wasn't surprised. Confrontation often made people uneasy, especially when it came to topics like race and privilege. But Marcus had long since learned to live with being uncomfortable. Tonight, it seemed, others would have to learn too. A subtle ally. A voice broke his thoughts. "Excuse me," a woman said softly from the aisle. Marcus turned to see a middle-aged woman standing there, her face framed by a curtain of dark curls. Her eyes were kind but held a quiet determination. She had been seated a few rows behind him, though he hadn't noticed her earlier. "I just wanted to say," she began, her voice low enough not to draw attention, "that I saw what happened. And I'm sorry you had to go through that." Her words caught him off guard. Marcus was used to standing up for himself, often in isolation. Having someone acknowledge his experience was unexpected and deeply appreciated. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means a lot." The woman hesitated, as if debating whether to continue. "It's not the first time I've seen something like this," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "I work in HR, and I've had to address situations like this more times than I can count. People like her, they think they're subtle, but their biases are loud and clear." Marcus nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "It's louder when you're on the receiving end." She smiled back, though the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. "If there's anything I can do, if you want a witness or need someone to corroborate what happened, let me know. It's the least I can do." "I appreciate that," Marcus replied. "It's good to know someone else noticed." The woman nodded once more before returning to her seat. Her brief but sincere gesture gave Marcus a sense of solidarity he hadn't expected. Maybe he wasn't as alone in this as he had thought. A stirring in the shadows. As the plane continued its steady course, Marcus's thoughts shifted to what would come next. He knew the captain's intervention was just the first step. The real test would be how the airline handled the incident after the flight landed. Would they treat it as an isolated event, or as a symptom of a larger issue? Marcus's phone buzzed softly in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a message from his assistant, Claire. She had booked this flight for him and had a knack for checking in at just the right moment. "Hope the flight's going well. Let me know if you need anything on arrival." Marcus hesitated before typing a response. Part of him wanted to brush it off, to avoid the conversation altogether. But another part of him knew that staying silent wouldn't serve anyone. Not himself, not the countless others who face similar situations every day. "Flight's fine now, but there was an incident with one of the crew. I'll fill you in later. Might need your help drafting a formal complaint." Claire's response was almost immediate. "Of course. Whatever you need." The simple exchange steadied him. Marcus was no stranger to advocating for himself, but knowing he had a support system behind him made the task feel less daunting. The ripples of courage. As the plane neared its destination, the cabin lights brightened, signaling the approach of descent. Passengers began to stir, folding blankets, adjusting seats, and preparing for landing. Marcus watched the flurry of activity with a mix of anticipation and unease. He knew that the flight's end wouldn't be the end of this ordeal. It was merely the beginning of the next chapter. The younger flight attendant approached his seat once more, her demeanor as kind and professional as ever. "Mr. Taylor," she said, her voice quiet, "I just wanted to personally apologize for what happened earlier. It's not reflective of how we want our passengers to feel." Marcus looked at her, gauging the sincerity in her words. "Thank you," he said after a moment. "But this goes beyond an apology. It's about accountability and change." She nodded, her expression serious. I understand, and I'll make sure the captain includes this in his report. What happened wasn't right. Marcus gave her a small nod of appreciation. He could see that she meant well, even if she wasn't in a position to change the larger system. A gathering storm. As the plane descended through the clouds, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wouldn't let this incident fade into the background, becoming just another story to share among friends or colleagues. It was bigger than him now, and he knew he had a responsibility to see it through. When the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the gate, Marcus gathered his belongings, his mind already racing with the steps he needed to take. As passengers began to disembark, he stayed seated, waiting until the aisle cleared. The middle-aged woman who had spoken to him earlier paused as she passed. "Good luck," she said softly. "And don't let them brush this under the rug." Marcus nodded, her words bolstering his resolve. "I won't." As he stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, Marcus felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about one flight attendant's behavior. It was about challenging a culture that allowed such behavior to thrive. His phone buzzed again, this time with an email notification. Opening it, he saw a message from the airline's customer relations team, likely a standard follow-up to the incident. But Marcus wasn't interested in standard responses. He wanted change, and he was prepared to fight for it. A voice that cannot be ignored. Marcus walked through the terminal, his rolling carry-on trailing behind him. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, and the hum of travelers filled the air. But Marcus wasn't focused on the usual airport chaos. His mind was sharp, his thoughts fixed on the actions he needed to take. He paused at a row of chairs near baggage claim, pulling out his phone. The airline's email notification sat at the top of his inbox, subject line reading, "We'd value your feedback." The words felt hollow, a template response to an issue they were likely hoping would fade away quietly. Marcus opened the email, scanning the text. "Dear Mr. Taylor, we regret to hear about your recent experience on Flight 718. At Airline Name, we strive to provide all of our customers with exceptional service, and it seems we fell short during your flight. We take these matters very seriously and would like to assure you that an internal review has been initiated. Please reply to this email with any further details you wish to provide so we can address your concerns promptly. We apologize for any discomfort or inconvenience caused. Your satisfaction and trust are our priorities. Sincerely, Customer Relations Team." Airline Name. Marcus read the email twice, his frustration building with each line. The words were polite but impersonal, the kind of response designed to placate rather than address the root cause. He leaned back in the chair, the cool leather pressing against his shoulders as he crafted his reply. Subject: Follow-up to discriminatory incident on Flight 718. To whom it may concern. While I appreciate your acknowledgement of the incident, I need to be clear. This isn't just about discomfort or a minor lapse in service. What I experienced was blatant, targeted discrimination from a member of your flight crew. Her words and actions were not only unprofessional, but also indicative of deeper biases that have no place in your organization, or anywhere, for that matter. This isn't something that can be resolved with a generic apology or an internal review. I intend to pursue this matter until I see meaningful accountability and change. Your airline must address this incident not as an isolated event, but as a symptom of a larger problem that needs to be actively rooted out. I expect a formal follow-up detailing the steps being taken to address this issue. Please also confirm receipt of this email. Sincerely, Marcus Taylor. He hit send and exhaled deeply. His words felt like a small push against a much larger wall, but he knew they were necessary. It wasn't just about seeking justice for himself. It was about creating a ripple that might prevent others from facing the same treatment. The social media spark. As Marcus waited for his luggage, he couldn't help but notice the world around him. Travelers hurried past, faces lit by phone screens, oblivious to his internal storm. It struck him how easy it was for stories like his to remain invisible, lost in the daily noise. Pulling out his phone again, he hesitated before opening his Twitter app. Marcus rarely used social media, preferring to keep his personal life private. But tonight, privacy felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. He drafted a post, the words flowing from his fingers with clarity born of conviction. At Marcus_Taylor, I was racially profiled and demeaned by a flight attendant on at Airlines Flight 718. Despite paying for a first-class ticket, I was made to feel like I didn't belong. This isn't just about me. It's about accountability. We need to call out discrimination when we see it. #NoteYourSeat. Marcus stared at the post for a moment, his thumb hovering over the tweet button. Then, with a deep breath, he pressed it. The tweet went live, and Marcus felt an odd mix of vulnerability and resolve. He knew the public response could go in any direction: support, criticism, or indifference. But he also knew that silence was no longer an option. The first waves. By the time Marcus retrieved his luggage, his phone was buzzing with notifications. Likes, retweets, and replies poured in, many from strangers who shared his anger or offered their support. This happens way too often. Thank you for speaking up. I'm sorry this happened to you. Let's hold them accountable. At Airline Name, care to explain? There were, of course, detractors as well. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. You're being too sensitive. Not everything is about race. Marcus expected these comments and chose to focus on the positive. The sheer volume of responses was overwhelming, but it was proof that his story resonated with people. He wasn't alone in this fight. A growing movement. Over the next few hours, Marcus's tweet began to gain traction. Prominent figures in social justice, journalism, and even the travel industry chimed in, amplifying his voice. The #NoteYourSeat started trending, a rallying cry for those who had been made to feel out of place in spaces they deserved to occupy. Stories began pouring in from others who had faced discrimination while traveling. Some were minor slights, judgmental looks, or dismissive tones. Others were outright injustices, from being denied upgrades to being removed from flights altogether. Marcus read each story with a heavy heart, his resolve hardening with every account. The airline's response. By morning, the airline had no choice but to respond. Their official Twitter account issued a statement. At Airline Name, we are aware of the incident involving Mr. Marcus Taylor on Flight 718. We take these allegations seriously and are conducting a thorough investigation. Discrimination of any kind has no place in our company. It was a start, but Marcus wasn't satisfied. He replied publicly. At Marcus_Taylor, words are easy. Action is what matters. What specific steps are you taking to address this and prevent it from happening again? #NoteYourSeat. The public pressure was mounting. News outlets picked up the story, and Marcus found himself fielding interview requests. The incident had struck a chord, shining a light on the subtle, insidious ways bias manifested in everyday life. A new responsibility. As Marcus scrolled through his notifications, one message stood out. It was from a young man who had been following the story. Thank you for standing up. People like me need to see this. We need to know we belong. Marcus sat with those words for a long moment. He had never intended to become a symbol or a spokesperson, but the role was now thrust upon him. And if his voice could make even the smallest difference, he was determined to use it. This fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been told, in ways subtle or overt, that they didn't belong. And Marcus wasn't about to let that message go unchallenged. The ripple effect. By the time Marcus stepped into his office the next morning, the world had taken notice. His tweet had gone viral, with over 100,000 retweets and comments, sparking a nationwide conversation. Major news outlets were running the story, and #NoteYourSeat had become a trending hashtag, not just in the US, but globally. Emails flooded his inbox, and his assistant, Claire, was already sifting through them when he arrived. "Marcus," she said, looking up with a mix of urgency and admiration, "I've never seen anything like this. There are messages from reporters, activists, lawyers, and even a few CEOs. Everyone wants to talk to you." Marcus set his bag down and leaned against the desk, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the situation. "This isn't just about me anymore," he said, glancing at Claire. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." Claire nodded. "The airline released another statement this morning. They're offering you a meeting with their senior leadership team and a public apology." "But," she hesitated. "But what?" Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. "They're also trying to frame this as a one-off incident," Claire said, sliding a printout of the statement toward him. "They're calling it an isolated lapse in judgment." Marcus scanned the document, his jaw tightening. "Typical corporate damage control," he muttered. "They want to downplay the systemic nature of the problem." Claire tilted her head. "What's the plan? Are you going to take the meeting?" Marcus thought for a moment before replying. "I'll take the meeting, but not for their sake. If they think they can brush this under the rug, they're wrong. This isn't just going to be a photo op for their PR team." The meeting. 2 days later, Marcus found himself in a sleek, glass-walled conference room at the airline's headquarters. Across the table sat the CEO, the head of customer relations, and several members of the company's legal and HR teams. Their polished smiles did little to mask their unease. The CEO, a middle-aged man with a perfectly tailored suit and an air of practiced charm, began the meeting. "Mr. Taylor, thank you for taking the time to meet with us. Let me start by saying how deeply sorry we are for your experience. It's unacceptable and not reflective of our company's values." Marcus listened, his expression calm but unyielding. "I appreciate the apology," he said after a pause, "but words alone aren't enough. This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about the culture that allowed it to happen." The CEO nodded, his smile faltering slightly. "We understand, and we're committed to making changes. We've already begun an internal review and will be implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff." "That's a start," Marcus replied, leaning forward slightly. "But training alone won't fix the problem. You need accountability. What's happening to the flight attendant who treated me that way? And what's your plan for ensuring this doesn't happen again, not just to first-class passengers, but to anyone on your flights?" The room grew quiet, the executives exchanging uneasy glances. The head of HR cleared her throat. "The employee in question has been suspended pending a full investigation. We're also reviewing our hiring and training practices to identify and address any unconscious biases." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. "I appreciate the steps you're taking, but this can't just be about damage control. It needs to be about real, lasting change. Your passengers and employees deserve better." The CEO leaned forward, his tone earnest. "Mr. Taylor, we'd like to work with you to ensure that happens. We value your perspective and believe you could play a key role in helping us create a more inclusive environment." Marcus hesitated. The offer was tempting. He could influence change from within, but he also knew the risks. He didn't want to become a figurehead for their PR campaign, a token used to deflect criticism. "I'll consider it," he said finally, "but only if I see genuine progress. I'm not here to help you save face. I'm here to make sure no one else goes through what I did." The movement grows. After the meeting, Marcus returned home to find his story continuing to gain momentum. The hashtag #NoteYourSeat had evolved into a broader movement, with people sharing stories of discrimination in all areas of life, not just on airplanes. Activists and organizations reached out, offering their support and sharing resources. Marcus decided to harness the energy of the moment. He teamed up with a group of civil rights advocates to create an initiative aimed at addressing bias and discrimination in the travel industry. The program, called Fly Fair, would advocate for policy changes, conduct independent reviews of airline practices, and provide a platform for passengers to report incidents of discrimination. Within weeks, FlyFair had gained significant traction. Airlines began reaching out, some proactively seeking to implement the program's recommendations. Others, however, resisted, dismissing the initiative as unnecessary. Marcus knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change rarely came without resistance, but he also knew that the movement had struck a nerve, and he was determined to keep pushing. Chance encounter. One evening, as Marcus walked through a crowded airport terminal, he was stopped by a young woman. She looked to be in her early 20s, her hair pulled back into a neat braid, and a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Mr. Taylor?" she asked hesitantly. "Yes," Marcus replied, curious. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I saw your story online, and it meant so much to me. I've dealt with things like that my whole life, and seeing someone stand up, it gave me hope." Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat. "What's your name?" he asked. "Jasmine," she said, her smile tentative. "Well, Jasmine, thank you for sharing that with me," Marcus said. "And don't forget, you belong wherever you choose to be." Jasmine nodded, her eyes shining. "I won't, thanks to you." As she walked away, Marcus stood still for a moment, the noise of the terminal fading into the background. Moments like this reminded him why he had chosen to speak out. The fight wasn't just about him. It was about creating a world where people like Jasmine could move through life without being questioned, doubted, or diminished. A legacy of change. Months later, as Marcus watched the first FlyFair conference unfold, he felt a sense of pride. Leaders from across the travel industry had gathered to discuss ways to combat bias and discrimination, and the energy in the room was palpable. It was a small step, but a meaningful one, a sign that progress was possible. The journey had been exhausting, frustrating, and at times disheartening, but it had also been transformative. Marcus had found his voice, and in doing so, had helped others find theirs. As the conference ended and applause filled the room, Marcus stood at the podium, looking out at the faces before him. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. He had turned his pain into purpose, and the ripples of that purpose would continue long after the applause faded. The closing chapter. As the applause in the conference hall slowly subsided, Marcus stepped back from the podium. The faces in the audience, a mix of activists, industry leaders, and everyday travelers, reflected hope and determination. This was more than a personal victory. It was the beginning of something bigger, a movement that could reshape an industry long overdue for change. Marcus walked off the stage, greeted by Samantha Green, the attorney who had first stood by him after the flight. Her expression was one of pride, her handshake firm. "You've done something incredible here," she said. "This isn't just about the airlines anymore. It's about changing the way people think, the way they act." Marcus smiled, his exhaustion softened by her words. "It's been a long road, but I'm not done yet." Samantha nodded. "And that's exactly why this will last. You didn't just create noise, you built a foundation." A personal reflection. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his hotel room, overlooking the city lights. The weight of the day, and the months leading up to it, settled on him. He thought back to that flight, to the moment when the flight attendant had made him feel like he didn't belong. At the time, it had been a singular, painful experience. Now, it felt like the first note in a much larger symphony. Marcus opened his laptop and began drafting a blog post. He wanted to capture everything: what had happened, what he had learned, and what he hoped for the future. The words came easily, flowing like a conversation with an old friend. "Belonging Isn't a Privilege," by Marcus Taylor. "When I boarded that flight months ago, I didn't expect my life to change. I didn't expect to find myself in the center of a conversation about race, bias, and belonging. But life has a way of pushing us toward moments that demand more from us than we think we can give. What happened to me on that plane wasn't unique. It was one story in a sea of many. But the response to my story showed me something powerful. People are ready for change. They're tired of the quiet biases, the unspoken judgments, and the systems that allow them to persist. Belonging isn't a privilege, it's a right. It's something we all deserve, no matter where we come from, what we look like, or how others perceive us. To anyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong, you do. Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise. And to those in positions of power, it's time to listen, to learn, and to act. The world is watching. This isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning. Marcus closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The words felt right, a way to close one chapter and open another. The aftermath. The next morning, Marcus's blog post went live, and the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from across the world, stories of solidarity, gratitude, and shared experiences. Marcus realized that the movement he had inadvertently started was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or unvalued. Flyfair continued to grow, becoming a cornerstone of advocacy in the travel industry. Policies began to change, not just in airlines, but in hotels, cruise lines, and other sectors. Training programs became more comprehensive, and accountability measures were introduced. The flight attendant who had sparked the initial incident was eventually let go, her actions deemed a breach of the company's values. While Marcus took no pleasure in her dismissal, he hoped it served as a reminder that words and actions carried weight. A final flight. Months later, Marcus boarded another first-class flight. This time, he was greeted warmly by the crew, their professionalism genuine and their smiles kind. He settled into his seat by the window, the clouds below reflecting the soft glow of the morning sun. As the plane ascended, Marcus thought about how far he had come, not just in his career, but in his understanding of what it meant to lead. Advocacy wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about being the voice that refused to be silenced. The flight attendant approached with a tray of drinks. "Mr. Taylor, can I get you anything?" "Just water," Marcus said, smiling. The attendant handed him a glass, her demeanor respectful and attentive. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt the comfort that first class was supposed to offer, not because of the seat or the service, but because he knew he belonged. As he looked out the window at the horizon, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The battle wasn't over, but progress had been made. And for now, that was enough.